Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I'm really delighted to be hosting this morning's event for an important discussion on developments in Hong Kong and what is the future prospect for Hong Kong as a global business hub. It has, needless to say, been a very tumultuous past few years for Hong Kong. We've seen the passage of the national security law. We've seen very restrictive COVID policies, which have ended in a fairly haphazard way and in ways that is causing a great amount of tragedy we're seeing in the mainland. And we've seen the emergence of this deep endemic U.S.-China rivalry, which of course has had profound effects on how businesses and investors think about where they invest and where they do business. And so as we start the new year, we thought this was an important moment to bring in some voices to talk about where Hong Kong stands, what are some of the challenges it faces, and what the road forward is. It's also important to be talking about Hong Kong, an issue which can often feel like it is left to the side of the policy discussion here in Washington, D.C. You hear many who say that Hong Kong is now, quote, just another mainland city. And I think what you'll hear from the voices today is that that is not necessarily the case. And the argument still stands that Hong Kong has institutions, civil society, media that is worth striving to protect. So the way today's discussion will go is joined by Hanscom Smith, who's the former Consul General of Hong Kong, is now at Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs, and his most important title, a Senior Associate Non-Resident here at the CSIS Freeman Chair. We are going to first turn to the current Consul General, Greg May, who will give a short keynote address, and then he and Hanscom will engage in a short virtual armchair discussion separated by a few thousand miles, but armchair nonetheless. We'll then turn to a really fantastic panel discussion afterwards where we'll get some reactions to the Consul General's remarks, but then we'll turn to them for their own expertise and on-the-ground views of where things are in Hong Kong. So we have Olivia Enos, who's the Washington Director for the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. We have Charles Wong, who's joining us virtually from Hong Kong and is staying up later than I ordinarily do. Charles is the chairman and CEO of Silkwave. And then beaming in from Baltimore is Ho Fung Hung, who's the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy at CSIS at Johns Hopkins. Final logistical note from me. Viewers can go to the CSIS website, and if you click on the link for this event, you will see a little button that says submit your question. And we welcome viewers at any time to input their question, either as Consul General May is speaking or during the panel. And when the panel discussion is ongoing, I'll be monitoring those and will attempt to weave those into the discussion if they're germane to the discussion and if we have time. So again, welcome viewers to submit questions at any time. With that, I'm just going to quickly turn the floor over to Hanscom, who will do a very, very, very brief handover to Greg in Hong Kong. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and I'm really excited for this discussion. So Hanscom, if I may.
Great. Thank you very much, Jude. And I think right now we're just very happy to turn it over to Greg May, who has been serving as the U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau since September of last year. So welcome, Consul General. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you. Good morning, good evening. Happy Lunar New Year to everyone. Thanks to CSIS and Jude for organizing this important event today and inviting me to participate. I'm especially pleased to appear alongside my predecessor, Hanscom Smith. Hanscom led the U.S. consulate over a really challenging period that included the 2019 to 2020 pro-democracy protests and, of course, the COVID pandemic. I want to focus my remarks today on my impressions of Hong Kong after spending just over 4 months here, and share my thoughts on how the ongoing political crackdown and diminished rule of law continues to hamper Hong Kong's future as a global business hub. One of my strongest impressions since my arrival is the sheer exhaustion of Hong Kongers with COVID-related controls. These controls cut off the city from the rest of the world for the better part of 3 years. And they stayed here longer than anywhere in the world with the exception of mainland China itself. When I got off the plane in September, and this was not terribly long ago, I had to do 3 days of quarantine, more than a week of daily COVID tests. And it was also very eerie to see the airport, one of Asia's most bustling, almost deserted. In those first few weeks here in the fall, many people I spoke to expressed a lot of anxiety about the damage the COVID controls were doing to Hong Kong's economy, and also worries that some of this damage may be permanent. Hong Kong's COVID response and the diminishing freedoms here have clearly impacted the city and the people in it. And one data point we can cite is the American community. We estimate that about 15,000 Americans, which represents about 20% of the 2019 population of US citizens, have moved out of Hong Kong in the last 2 years for various reasons. Of course, in the new year, these COVID barriers have come down, which is welcomed by many here. The border with mainland China is opening up, quarantine is lifted, travel, aviation links are back on, and Hong Kongers and Americans are eager to reestablish travel, business, cultural, and academic ties that have been in suspended animation for the duration of the pandemic. However, despite the desire on both sides to reconnect, there remains concerns about Hong Kong's reputation as a business center, which depends on adherence to international standards and the rule of law. One of the latest concerning developments for the rule of law was the National People's Congress Standing Committee's interpretation last month of the national security law. This interpretation could further undermine the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary system by expanding the Hong Kong executive branch authority to make decisions affecting cases without judicial oversight. In light of these and other developments, companies should be aware that the risks faced in mainland China are now increasingly present here in Hong Kong. The national security law and actions taken by Beijing and Hong Kong authorities may negatively impact company staff, finances, legal compliance, reputation, and operations. And we engage with the US private sector to build awareness of these risks. In response, some international firms in Hong Kong have relocated, while others are shifting key staff or operations elsewhere. Our view continues to be that Beijing's actions could further force many of the city's best and brightest to flee. We are continuing to see that exodus of people from Hong Kong. And of course, Hong Kong's position as a free global financial center will suffer as a result of this outflow. The United States will continue to call on the PRC to abide by its international obligations and commitments with respect to Hong Kong, to cease its dismantlement of Hong Kong's democratic institutions, autonomy and rule of law. We call on mainland and Hong Kong authorities to release immediately and drop all charges against individuals unjustly detained in Hong Kong and to respect human rights for all. I want to emphasize the United States is also very determined to maintain communication with the Hong Kong people. And on this point, I want to make a special mention of the importance of revitalizing academic exchange. We want more Hong Kongers going to the United States to study, and we want more Americans to come here. I've heard some very troubling statistics about the very low numbers of Americans who are studying in the mainland during this zero COVID era. It is in the interests of both the United States and China to build the next generation of scholars, business leaders, and government officials with experience and expertise in Chinese culture and Chinese language. And Hong Kong can and should play a key role in that. Despite worrying signs of declining academic freedom here, and this would include the sidelining or dismissal of professors, introduction of patriotic education classes, the dissolution of student unions, Hong Kong academics still enjoy more latitude to engage with their American counterparts than scholars in mainland China. Hong Kong universities remain some of the best in the region, and Hong Kong students some of the brightest and best prepared. This year, the U.S. consulate will initiate some programs to encourage renewed exchanges between American and Hong Kong universities and think tanks. Another strong impression that I've had in my time here is the decline in Hong Kong's media freedom. I knew, of course, before arriving that the closure of outlets such as Apple Daily and Stand News meant that Hong Kong's press is less free than before. It is still jarring, however, to see on a daily basis newspapers, and particularly the Chinese language press, so eager to toe Beijing's line and engage in self-censorship. One example, this past October, when someone hung a protest banner on a bridge in Beijing, and this banner contained some slogans critical of Xi Jinping. This event, which was very widely covered in the international press, went largely unreported in the Hong Kong media. Unfortunately, Hong Kong authorities have played a role in diminishing this press freedom, including by banning foreign journalists. The most recent case we saw, immigration officers on December 30th denied entry to a Japanese freelance photographer, Michiko Kiseki, who had chronicled the 2019 pro-democracy demonstrations in her work. The internet is also a very important litmus test for free expression here. Troublingly, Hong Kong officials have publicly demanded a leading search engine change search results to downgrade content related to the 2019 protests. And this is not a way to encourage new tech investment here. In addition, Hong Kong's government has expressed an intent to pass a law to combat fake news. While we have yet to see the proposed text of such a law, given Hong Kong authorities' recent track record of jailing individual internet users for online posts, the public is right to be concerned about further degradation of the ability to speak one's mind or report and comment on domestic and international affairs online. A third, and this is probably my deepest impression I have here, is the strong desire among Hong Kongers to persevere in a difficult situation and preserve Hong Kong's freedoms and legal practices to the greatest extent possible, given the reality of the national security law and Beijing's ultimate control over Hong Kong's path. Hong Kongers are rightly proud of their city and their society built on a long tradition of rule of law that Beijing had promised to respect. As Secretary Blinken himself stated last year when summarizing the Hong Kong Policy Act report, a fully functioning civil society, rule of law, and individual liberties form the bedrock on which vibrant societies grow. Many Hong Kongers share these views. I know many Hong Kongers do not support the harsh treatment of Apple Daily founder Jimmy Lai and other defendants who are in jail and facing trials under the national security law. They understand how the imprisonment of people for peaceful political expression undermines the rule of law and Hong Kong's long-term viability and attractiveness as an international hub. But despite the national security law, curtailments of freedoms, and erosion of autonomy, Hong Kong remains a destination for U.S. investment and trade. Hong Kong alone is the 7th largest export market for U.S. consumer-ready food products. Last year, and this is despite all of the challenges created by the pandemic, the United States exported about $30 billion in goods and $14 billion of services to Hong Kong, and the U.S. enjoys healthy trade surpluses in both categories. I would like to conclude my remarks on an optimistic note. While there is no shortage of frustration over diminishing freedoms in Hong Kong, many Hong Kongers still have hope for the city and, of course, want it to succeed just as the United States wants Hong Kong to succeed. We continue to advocate on behalf of the Hong Kong people, including through our engagement with the full spectrum of Hong Kong society and our allies and partners on the ground here. We'll continue to call out Hong Kong and mainland officials who further undermine the special administrative region's once high degree of autonomy. At the same time, we will maintain, where possible, our cooperation with Hong Kong authorities. And this cooperation extends to climate change, to public health, transnational crime, counter-narcotics, people-to-people exchanges, and other issues that benefit both Hong Kongers and Americans. Ultimately, however, Hong Kong's future success will hinge on its competitiveness and global reputation, which are inseparable from preservation of fundamental freedoms and respect for rule of law. And finally, let me emphasize the United States will always stand for the rule of law and human rights in Hong Kong as we do around the world. We will not give up on building our relationship with Hong Kong, and especially our friendship with the Hong Kong people. Thank you very much for listening and again for inviting me today.
Great, thank you very much, Consul General. And as you said, it's been an enormously challenging several years for the city. And when we focus on the business status of Hong Kong, I'd like to get your sense of what you're hearing from U.S. companies on the ground about their biggest concerns regarding the business climate.
Well, I've spoken, Hanscom, to many different companies. We have over 13 U.S. businesses still present here in Hong Kong. I will say there's a diversity of views among these companies. But in terms of business concerns, I mean, until very recently, COVID was obviously, and COVID restrictions were obviously high up there. They just created a lot of practical barriers to doing business. But beyond that, I have heard concerns about rule of law. How much further is rule of law and judicial independence going to erode here? Some upcoming policies regarding data and where data can be stored. I think companies are concerned that Hong Kong will continue to support a free flow of data and information. And also, one thing I hear very clearly, and this isn't just American companies, but across the board, is talent. I mentioned in my prepared remarks, that Hong Kong is losing population. I've seen some figures that 150,000 Hong Kongers have decided to depart, and that affects businesses across the board.
Thanks. So one of the areas that you stressed in your remarks is the fact that the United States has always wanted Hong Kong to succeed. But as we both know very well, when the United States raises its concerns, it's accused both by the Hong Kong and the central governments of quote unquote interfering in Hong Kong's affairs. How can the United States best make the case that preserving rights and freedoms is critical to ensuring Hong Kong's status as a globally competitive business hub?
I mean, I think what we have done and will continue to do is just remain engaged, speaking with Hong Kongers across the political spectrum, the business community, government, where possible. But the point we're making, this point about so-called interference, we have over 1,300 companies, U.S. companies here, as I mentioned. We have tens of billions in U.S. investment here. Although the numbers have gone down, we still have what we estimate about 70,000 U.S. citizens who continue to live in Hong Kong. So we have a lot of interests here. We feel the United States has been a big part of Hong Kong's success over many decades. That success, of course, is mainly attributed to the hard work of Hong Kongers. But when you have interests like this, you will speak up when you see those interests being eroded and all the concerning trends that we're seeing here. And that's not interference.
So Hong Kong, for many companies, is increasingly a hub for doing business on the mainland, but its position as a regional and a global hub has eroded due to a lot of the factors that you've outlined. What do you think the city can do, and what are you hearing from businesses about its ability to improve its role both as a regional and global hub?
I mean, I think, Hanscom, everyone knows, Hong Kong has been very successful historically as kind of this gateway or interface with mainland China and the region. Many hope that can continue. Hong Kong's success in this regard is specifically because it's not another mainland city, that it is definitely different from the mainland. Here in Hong Kong, you had good courts, you once had a free press, just simple things like the internet functioning better here. You don't have to use a VPN like you do in mainland China. All these things were attractive to people, attracted people to Hong Kong. I think there's hope that mainland and Hong Kong authorities can return to the path of the high degree autonomy, return to the joint statement and the principles outlined there, restore civil society, stop the erosion of rule of law and freedoms here. Hanscom, when you were Consul General, you often said, let Hong Kong be Hong Kong, and I think that phrase still applies. The key to success is to let Hong Kong continue as it historically has been.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to Greg, and we'll let him go to bed now. I know it's late over in Hong Kong, but I'd like to now bring in the rest of the panel. And if I may, Charles, I'd like to start with you and ask, on the ground in Hong Kong and deeply integrated with the business community there and thinking about Hong Kong as a global business hub, can I get your overall perspective on where Hong Kong stands in 2023 in light of legal developments, the national security law, in light of the shifting regulatory environment in the mainland, U.S.-China competition, and of course, the policies on COVID. Can you give us a level set on how you see Hong Kong, in January of 2023? I think you might be, Charles, you might be on mute.
Okay.
There
Can you hear me
go.
now?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I think on the whole, Hong Kong is facing significant challenges. I mean, although they are not insurmountable, but it will take time and patience to work through. And let's start with the national security law, right? I mean, I think the national security law will continue to rein in every aspect of Hong Kong and show the political environment for the right or wrong reason, but it is here to stay. And the side effect of that is really breeding quite a bit of uncertainty and wariness for the business community. It is the fact that large sum of capital and a large number of professionals have relocated away from Hong Kong, and notably to Singapore, just like the Consul General mentioned. And I mean, currently, what I heard from our lawyers, like there are 30 family offices being set up in Singapore every month, and most of the money is really from Hong Kong and from China. And I think altogether, since last year, maybe about a quarter to or 500,000 people, mostly young and the middle class, left Hong Kong, and these impacts are not small. But having said so, right? I mean, the national security law, every country has that. I mean, the U.S., U.K., Japan, everyone, right? And some of them could be even more stringent than that of Hong Kong. And that's something I think we have to find a way to live with it. And I think it's not really the national security law that's the issue, but the lack of clarity and detail of how the law will be implemented and being used. It is no question that the national security law, when it's introduced, brought back a lot of stability and harmony and social cohesion in Hong Kong in the shortest possible time. But at the same time, I mean, the national security law was conjured up in China as a directive, not a full body of law governing the national security issues in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is supposed to actually follow up with its own legislature to perfect that under its own Article 23 of the Basic Law, which has not happened. So therefore, I would think, the earlier we can actually have a more transparent Article 23, which can really fully spell out the national security law in detail, I think we can really clear a lot of the air. I mean, if we were to live with the national security law, which I think is a necessity, I think everybody should actually have a very clear understanding of it, and the law has to be very, very transparent. And that is actually a pretty important aspect. And then moving to other things like the changes in China, and especially a lot of the business change, to crack down on the attack, and I mean giving the sense that is China really moving back to the planned economy, is really changing the overall architecture of economic reform and things like that. And I understand, I mean, how the sentiment came about, and the somewhat heavy-handed crackdown of the big tech company does have its unintended consequences, such like putting down the businesses and dampening the business sentiment, and even discouraging many entrepreneurs from really doing what they are doing the best. And even some people are really worried about whether China is really moving back to the planned economy. But again, I think China is not really out there really trying to undo these like big businesses, but really rein in certain runaway monopolies that were wielding excessive power, excessive economic and financial control, which can distort the competition. And what China wants is really to return to some kind of a social normalcy or social balance. I mean, a case in point, a couple of years ago, China experienced this P2P financial market collapse. And currently, we have this giant real estate company, Evergrande, is still trying to work out its way. I mean, these are very messy things for the economy. And China has 1.4 billion people. Any small thing can be magnified profusely. So I think that some measure to rein in some of these businesses might be necessary. Right. But having said so, I think what China is really trying to do is really learn from the West that not to allow some of the giant giant monopoly to go uncontrollable. And as we all know, in China, money does not run politics. It can never be really allowed to run politics. And also, China is a socialist country by design, so equitable income distribution and avoidance of extreme disparity among the most important delivery the government has to the people. So China is doing whatever thing it can do. Then that being said, some of the drastic measure does reflect China's limitation on sophisticated policy tools and legal options. Not like in the U.S. And I mean, the U.S., you have a very mature and developed legal system to deal with all these like big businesses and monopoly and in extreme business environment. And China, even to today, can still only rely on the ad hoc and personal driven policy and just the way it is. And China just need time to develop its commercial law, to develop its legal system to be compatible with a lot of changes that actually run ahead of the legal infrastructure. Yeah. And I would say of all, the biggest impact to Hong Kong really is the COVID. And I mean, Hong Kong has been cut off from the rest of the world for 3 years, and both from China and the rest of the world. And I think the smartest thing Hong Kong has done at the end of the COVID is really to avoid the shutdown like many of the Chinese city, which otherwise would have really damaged Hong Kong in an irreversible way. But nevertheless, the relaxation of COVID is very welcoming. I think it will generate great momentum to propel Hong Kong back to its luster. I mean, Hong Kong is a very, very resilient place, and it's in Hong Kong's DNA. If you look at Hong Kong's past 150 years of history, Hong Kong thrive in every crisis, and that's how actually people in Hong Kong would like to do things. They never really give up, and they always try their best and to survive. And Hong Kong, even to today, I believe is still the best place to live and to work. So I believe with the COVID policy ending and recovery can be swift and strong.
Charles, I wonder if just a quick follow-up to that. You mentioned the interesting data point about hearing about family offices moving from mainland and Hong Kong to Singapore. One of the things we hear frequently is that companies and investors are looking to Tokyo, Singapore as respites from some of the uncertainty that you, I think, eloquently outlined that's occurring on the regulatory, political, and legal front in Hong Kong. Do you see Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul as now vying for that regional or even global status as business hubs, or do you think, as seemed to be the case at the end of your remarks, that if Hong Kong can see a post-COVID rebound and I don't know if normalization is the right word, but at least some consistency in the implementation of the national security law, that sort of Hong Kong can regain its old status as the unchallenged regional business hub?
Sure. It is no doubt that, I mean, all the countries that you mentioned has taken a bit of the luster off Hong Kong. And that's unfortunate, especially during the past 3 years when Hong Kong was so cut off from the rest of the world. But the bedrock of Hong Kong's success as a global hub lies, I think, in two great things. One is a well-established international legal system, and the other is the freedom of movement for people and capital. right? Which I think those two things remain remarkably intact, and they compare quite favorably even to other countries such as Singapore, Korea, Japan, and Thailand, right? And I think these are the things will, at the end of the day, hold Hong Kong as a top international hub. And above all, Hong Kong has an irreplaceable advantage. That is, Hong Kong is the only true free special economic zone for China to the rest of the world, right? With its own administration, own rule of law, own capitalist system, international population. So therefore, the sheer size of the Chinese economy, they will flow through Hong Kong, whether through Hong Kong to the West, to ASEAN, to Africa, to Europe, will simply dwarf anything and will make Hong Kong a global hub a no-brainer. So I'm confident that Hong Kong definitely, with the rebound of the economy, with the opening up, with the COVID subsiding, it will come back up again. At the end of the day, I mean, Hong Kong is a very mercantilistic place. Money talks. Just like the business of America's business, the Chinese are pretty much the same as well. Imagine, like, if the whole U.S. economy is channeled through New York as its window to the world, how can New York not become the global hub? Same thing for Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, I think, will become even more important a place for China to reach out to the rest of the world, especially given its geopolitical, given the current geopolitical situation, right? However, that's really not. However, there is some danger, to the whole scenario. That is, I mean, the geopolitics. Hong Kong can be so succumb to the bad side of the geopolitics, especially the U.S.-China relations. If Hong Kong were to be the front door to China and its bridge to the rest of the world, I think the two big economies, the China and U.S., getting along is absolutely important. And political stability of Hong Kong, so far, historically, has been paramount to its being a global hub. And the question is, how should China and U.S. get along? I think that's another question. I think the CSIS would have much better answer than me on that.
Fortunately for you, Charles, we haven't figured out an answer to that question either, and I don't see an answer in the near future. Olivia, I wonder if I can turn to you now. I know the committee has just put out this big new report a few days ago, a policy roadmap to support the people of Hong Kong. At the sort of at the back end of this conversation, I'm going to ask you more specifically about some of the specific recommendations. But one of the things that struck me, and maybe to some extent in contradistinction to what Charles has just said, is the report argues that Hong Kong has shifted from being a global financial center to a Chinese financial center. So I wonder if you can explain what underlines the committee's view that has seen that significant shift, and also just bring in any of the other perspectives that you have on either the Consul General's remarks or what we've heard from Charles so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Jude, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to highlight the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation's new report. One of the things that we really noted in the report, and I think is evident to a lot of folks watching what's happened over the last several years, is that the national security law represented a tectonic shift in the future of Hong Kong. And that tectonic shift was from a autonomous, freedom-loving Hong Kong to a Hong Kong that is, by and large, under the thumb of Beijing. And I think there can be no doubt that tectonic shift has had implications for civil and political liberties in Hong Kong. I think the Consul General really clearly outlined a lot of the concerns that we have: political prisoners, the deterioration in press freedom, the fact that you've just seen a massive shift in that. But one of the questions when the NSL was introduced was, what does this mean for the business community? Does this actually result in a change in the business operating environment? And I think for us at CFHK, the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason why is, as I was doing the research for this report, I observed three different communities that noted the changes in the business operating environment. The first, of course, is the US and the international community. You saw the State Department issue an advisory to businesses, making them aware of these new risks that they now faced as a result of the national security law. So there were 5 risks in particular. One, I think the Consul General covered really thoroughly. This is the deterioration in the rule of law in Hong Kong that has been very, very significant and doesn't just have implications for civil and political liberties. The second is the risk that businesses place to or face from electronic surveillance. As we've seen in the mainland, there's a lot of concerns that that's going to come to Hong Kong. The third is limited access to accurate information about what's going on the ground because of the deteriorations in press freedom. The fourth is engagement with sanctioned individuals, which I'll touch upon a little bit briefly in my third point. And then the fifth is the risk of PRC retaliation in response to the international community's condemnation of what we did see happen in 2020 in Hong Kong. But it's not just the US and the international community that are taking note. The business community has also taken note. The American Chamber conducted a survey in 2022 where they asked business leaders, what is your perception of the impacts of the national security law? And 8 out of 10 businesses said that they felt the impacts of the national security law due to the deteriorations in the rule of law and the concerns that they had related to that. And 60% noted worsening conditions specifically because of the rule of law. And although a relatively small percentage of businesses, I think it was something around 5%, the survey said, were actively thinking about moving out of Hong Kong, I'm very curious to see the 2023 survey to see whether or not even more businesses are thinking about leaving Hong Kong, because I think there can be no doubt that between 2022 and 2023, we've seen a continued decline, a continued deterioration in the rule of law in Hong Kong. Third and finally, there's a last community that has really noted the changes in Hong Kong, and that's bad actors, rogue actors, actors that actually pose a threat to U.S. national security. Hong Kong for a long time has served as a hub for money laundering, has housed shell companies, has been involved in sanctions evasion, but we've seen just over the past year this increasing. And one of the big concerns or the big data points that I look to is, Chief Executive John Lee said, we're not going to be instituting U.S. unilateral sanctions when Alexei Mordashov, the Russian oligarch, parked his mega yacht in Hong Kong. And so this in and of itself is a decision to disregard global norms and U.S. rule of law. But beyond this, we've even seen Hong Kong serving as a means of sanctions evasion for Russia. Clearly, and beyond this, we're seeing that they're actually selling chips to Russia. There's been a report by Reuters that was in violation of U.S. requirements that we not sell chips and semiconductors to Russia, but Hong Kong is continuing to do so. And Russia's not the only one. There's Iran and North Korea, Burma, and other bad actors that Hong Kong is now providing a safe space for them to operate. And so I think I have a lot of concerns, and I think these are all signs of how conditions inside the city-state have eroded since the institution of the national security law. And I think, to end very quickly here, one really poignant article that came out amidst the protests in Hong Kong was written by Martin Lee. And it said, one of our biggest fears, this is pre-institution of the NSL, is that Hong Kong is going to become like Beijing. And the biggest fear or the foundation that was undergirding that was this idea that in Beijing there is no rule of law. And the fear was that Hong Kong would become like that. And I think we're seeing Martin Lee's fears really starting to be realized here now.
Great, thank you, Olivia. Ho-Fung, appreciate you waiting patiently. But I wanted to turn to you now and ask some of what we've been hearing throughout this conversation, starting with the Consul General's remarks, but going through all the speakers so far, has been thinking about some of the strains on Hong Kong's ability to attract and retain talent, but also to attract and retain money, investment. And so I wanted to get your take on how you assess those strains that Hong Kong is under right now to attract and retain investment and talent. And what do you think the implications will be for the city if it continues to struggle on these two fronts?
Thank you for organizing this terrific panel, and happy to be with my distinguished panelists. And I'm not going to repeat what is being said, and I agree with most is already said. And Hong Kong in the last 150 short period of time, 10, 20 years, is constantly worried about being replaced. Hong Kong is Hong Kong being a hub for talents and money from around the world, and most importantly from mainland China is concentrating in because there's a lot of capital from mainland China, which the financial system of which is relatively closed. So the companies and wealthy people in China need to go to Hong Kong to get access to the global economy. So 10, 15, 20 years ago, the worry is that Hong Kong will be replaced by Shanghai and Shenzhen when China open up its financial market further. So the wealthy people and company in China and the talents related to this will directly get access to the global economy in Shanghai, in Shanghai, in Shenzhen. But of course, then more recently, we know that China definitely is not going into this direction of opening up its financial market. It is becoming closer and closer. Now, as Charles mentioned, that there's a lot of report about Hong Kong being replaced by places farther away from mainland China, Singapore, and even Ireland and many other places. So the crux of the problem is that whether companies in China and wealthy mainland Chinese people feel that they are safe to keep their wealth in Hong Kong. And right now, after the protests in 2019 and the national security law, it seems that there's doubt about it. And people with wealth from mainland China, they fear that Hong Kong might not be spared from the anti-corruption campaign and also the common prosperity agenda from China. So going to somewhere farther away from Hong Kong will be a wise thing for them, at least diversify some of their wealth to them. So it is one of the key issues, whether these wealthy people from mainland China and companies feel that Hong Kong is safe. And another thing is, of course, the education system of Hong Kong. And we don't yet have a systemic large-scale surveyed about who and why people are leaving Hong Kong, but we know from all this indirect data and anecdotal reports from the media is that a lot of middle-class people are leaving, and school children are actually leaving the school system because their parents worry about the future of the education system when the patriotic education and the more ideological control is being imposed in the school and in the universities, that the middle class and upper middle class with kids are really considering moving the family outside of Hong Kong. So it is another factor. And of course, that I'm not saying that Hong Kong is very bleak and the future is very, very dark. It is already quite bad, but it can be actually even worse. And then it is not the worst. It can get worse. And now what we need to do and discuss is how to prevent it from getting worse. Just last week, actually, John Lee has an interview with Hong Kong Commercial Daily, which is a traditional pro-establishment newspaper, and he talked about that they are going to revive the Article 23 legislation, anti-subversion law. It is not clear whether they can achieve it and what is the details of the law. We need to see it, but it can potentially mark a major deterioration of the situation, because people might ask, with the national security law, why Hong Kong still need Article 23, why we need to worry about it. But actually, there's something that potentially will be covered by Article 23, which is not yet directly covered by the national security law. For example, when the Article 23 is being discussed in 2003, in the 2003 version, there is mentioning of the theft of state secret. That is something that will affect the financial sector severely. And if we remember, then in 2003, one of the key opponents or key actors that expressed reservation about the Article 23 at that time is the banking sector. At that time, it is represented by David Lee, which is actually quite a pro-establishment figure, but he expressed reservation about the Article 23 back then. And of course, the Liberal Party, who represent the business interests, because this theft of state secret and will put a direct jeopardy to financial analysts who lead to research on, for example, well-connected Chinese enterprise and state-owned enterprise trading in the Hong Kong stock market, that they might lead to worry after the law or that kind of version of law is being enacted, whether researching on this well-connected, politically well-connected and state enterprise to discover some dirt or some irregularity of their business, would it constitute a crime, theft of state secret? So it is a kind of a worry among the financial sectors. And of course, that right now that they already have some indirect way to deal with this kind of research and analysis. A few years ago, there's American short sellers by the name of Andrew Left, which is widely report his case because he's trading in Hong Kong stock market. He's a short seller, and he published a report warning about Evergrande, now the troubled and disgraced real estate developer in mainland China. Back then, he's just saying that Evergrande is insolvent and it is dangerous to invest in it. And then the financial regulators in Hong Kong actually penalize him and charge him hefty fines and suspend his license to trade in Hong Kong for a few years. And in which respect, he's right that Evergrande is in trouble, but he just said it a few years earlier, but then the financial regulator at the time penalized him for it. Then people might ask if there's a kind of Article 23, again, that it depends on the version and the details, that whether this kind of discussion or financial analysts report that is routine in the financial center will constitute a crime under this kind of situation. And in the interview, Johnny mentioned that the Article 23 being drafted right now will plug some loophole that he didn't give any detail, but he mentioned espionage. And then he's saying that people might be jeopardizing national security by disguising as something else, like a seminars or other things. Then and it might point to a possibility. Then right now, the national security law cracked down on pro-democracy activists, organization, free press. But if the Article 23 is enacted in the most draconian way and version, that it is potentially troubling because people who are totally not political can be suspected or charged for they are just disguising as a scholar, a journalist, or businessman, but actually they are spying for foreign powers. And we see a lot of these kind of cases in mainland China, for journalists being detained or arrested for being charged for spying for foreign governments or stealing state secret. It hasn't happened a lot, or if at all, in Hong Kong. But one possibility is that after the Article 23 is enacted, and Johnny is saying that he planned to get it done in this year or next year, that we'll see whether it is the case. Then it will put a lot of people who are non-political and maybe just doing business, doing academic research, or doing journalism will be in jeopardy. And it is something that we need to watch closely. I'm not saying that it is going to go down this direction, to be sure. We have some examples showing that Beijing still care about the financial hub function of Hong Kong, so they might not go that far. One example is that in 2021, there's a lot of chatter about applying the national anti-foreign sanction laws to Hong Kong. And it will, if it is enacted, and it will put business in Hong Kong in great danger, because they have to choose between abiding by U.S. sanction or abiding by the Chinese law. If the anti-foreign sanction law is applied to Hong Kong, in the end, they backpedal and then they shelve it. And apparently, worry that this will really drive foreign business away from Hong Kong and end Hong Kong role as a financial hub. So there's some restraint on the part of Beijing. They still worry about hurting Hong Kong financial hub role too much. So with regard to this kind of talk about reviving the Article 23 legislation, again, that we don't know what it is going to be like. we need to learn about the details and to assess how much it will further hurt Hong Kong's centrality as a financial hub of China and the world. But it is something that we need to watch closely and in constant attention. So it's my remark today, but thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ho-Feng. Hanscom, I wonder if I can turn to you now. First of all, any thoughts you have on the discussion so far, but I'd like to ask you to weigh in on this issue of predictability and transparency, and if you think global business sees it in Hong Kong as still existing. I was interested in Ho-Feng's last comment, which maybe tangentially I can ask you to weigh in on, because something both Charles and Ho-Feng has said is, in different ways, we're still seeing some signs that Beijing and the Hong Kong government needs to factor in how various actions might affect the business community. And that pullback of implementation of the anti-foreign sanctions law, again, it's one data point, but it does seem to indicate that there are at least some awareness of where they might be pushing too far, and how that might affect the way that global businesses think about the predictability and transparency of Hong Kong. So what's your overall perspective on this, and do you think Hong Kong is still in a position to be able to be attracting and retaining international businesses and talent?
I think one of the most troubling things I heard when I was in Hong Kong and the national security law was imposed by Beijing were repeated comments by officials that the national security law will only apply to a small number of people. Well, that was a very revealing and problematic comment because, of course, in a rule of law system, the law applies to everyone equally. And instead, what we've seen is the national security law used as a form of lawfare to target people who are seen as political opponents. And it's clear to me that Beijing's primary concern is what it characterizes as political stability. In fact, I don't think that because the underlying problems that motivated the protests in 2019 have not been addressed, instead, the national security law is being used as a tool for coercion. The idea seems to be that Hong Kong can maintain its status as a globally competitive hub, while the national security law and the political repression creates an atmosphere of uncertainty. And while on balance, the business climate may be better for many companies than it would be on the mainland, it's certainly not what everyone experienced in Hong Kong in the past. And that uncertainty still hangs over the head of all companies who are doing business in Hong Kong. You simply don't know exactly how the national security law is going to be applied, or I think more accurately used as a tool. And when you combine that with some of the erosion of civil society and the free press that the Consul General outlined earlier, you're eroding the underpinnings that made Hong Kong such a uniquely successful, not just base for doing business on the mainland, but regional and global hub.
I wanted to pick up and maybe come back around to the full group on something that Ho-Feng had mentioned, and seems to be the natural next question after the assessments we've had from everyone here, which are to varying degrees ranging from bleak to not good. Although, again, a strong point here is that we shouldn't, we should remember fundamentally the remaining vibrancy of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong people, the Hong Kong business climate. This is not, again, I think what we're saying is this is not the mainland yet. But it's that question of yet that I wanted to talk about with everyone. Ho-Feng said, how do we prevent this from getting worse? And that seems to be the nub of the question in foreign capitals and for folks who are currently invested in, thinking about investing in, or just have genuine affinity for Hong Kong. It seems like if picking up on Charles's point, unprobable that we're going to see the national security law, that genie put back in the bottle. So what tools are out there that can try to maintain this delta between where the mainland is and the unique institutions, semblance, the remaining semblance of rule of law, judiciary independence in Hong Kong? Olivia, I might just start with you because you've just put out this big new report, and obviously the roadmap is not about how do we protect Hong Kong as a global business hub, but has direct implications for that. So I wonder, can you just let us know, first of all, just give us a broad brush of what the roadmap is saying, and then maybe to narrow down on this question of what tools do you think the U.S. government and the international community has to try to protect that space that still exists in Hong Kong?
Yeah, absolutely. So the report itself lays out a three-pronged strategy to support the people of Hong Kong. And I love that a common theme, I think, among all of our comments has been, how do we support the people of Hong Kong? And so this three-pronged strategy focuses first on accountability for bad actors, both within the Chinese Communist Party as well as in Hong Kong. The second prong of the strategy is looking at support for Hong Kong people who remain in Hong Kong. And then the third prong of the report advocates for support for those who have no choice but to flee, those who are targeted for their political activism and for their support and defense of freedom. There are a number of different recommendations in this report. I think there's 15 plus, so I would encourage people to check out the full report. But I wanted to highlight just 5, and I think several of them are of particular relevance to the business community. The first is, we have a lot of sanctions authorities that already exist on the books, thanks to Congress, Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and otherwise, that are very useful for targeting individuals and entities in Hong Kong who are responsible for eroding freedoms. We need to be taking full advantage of those. And in fact, under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, there's the ability for the U.S. government to target financial institutions that are engaged in bad behavior that's led to what we're seeing today. So I think those tools should absolutely be used if we want to maintain, any semblance of the rule of law in Hong Kong. The second is we need to ratchet up sanctions further. There's a tool that the U.S. government has, Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, that enables the U.S. government to target jurisdictions, sets of transactions, and financial institutions as primary money laundering concerns. And as I mentioned earlier, there are several rogue actors engaging in sanctions evasion, undermining of the rule of law, the housing of shell companies, these sorts of activities that it's unlikely, and I think even unwise, to think about designating Hong Kong as an entirety as a primary money laundering concern. There is legitimate business and industry operating there, but specific sets of transactions and specific institutions may be ripe for sanctioning, and that should be investigated by Treasury and by FinCEN. The third is that we should be looking at pressing for the closure of the economic and trade offices, the Hong Kong economic and trade offices. There are 3 of them here in the U.S. There are several more that are located abroad. But here in the U.S., given the fact that we decertified Hong Kong's special status, they shouldn't continue to receive special treatment, and individuals who are employed at the ETOs enjoy diplomatic status akin to that of an embassy. So we would urge the closure of those economic and trade offices. The fourth is that we've got to put in place protections for press freedom and internet freedom. Data security is a huge concern for many businesses. That's come up throughout various people's comments here today. And so I think we need to be really looking for giving businesses the best access to accurate information on the ground, which means preserving that space for freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of the internet. And the fifth and final one, I was so glad to hear Consul General Greg May hammering on this, is that the U.S. has got to be standing on the side of political prisoners, pressing for the release of every single one of them in Hong Kong. We would love to see, for example, a member of Congress adopting someone like Jimmy Lai or Joshua Wong, advocating for their case and making really clear that these people should not be in prison. And so hopefully the policy roadmap lays out a the U.S. government can certainly speak out, and we as individuals can certainly speak out in defense of Hong Kongers who are facing persecution. But we need the business community to be echoing many of those concerns. And I think the business community can serve as a voice for good when they stand in defense of freedoms, when they're under an onslaught, when they're under fire. And so I'd love to see a lot more outspokenness from the business community, highlighting some of the concerning trends that we're seeing in Hong Kong and complementing that with the work and the interests that they have in Hong Kong as those continue.
Great, thank you. Charles, I wonder if I can go to you and ask something of the same question, but if you were, if I've just had you promoted to be official business climate czar for Hong Kong, what are the recommendations that you would be making to the Hong Kong government and by extension to Beijing on what are the concrete steps that could be taken to improve the business climate? You've mentioned some of these in your introductory remarks about clarity and predictability on some issues surrounding the national security law. But what other recommendations might you have? And I want to ask a second question because just to create something of a dialogue here, are there actions that you think foreign governments might take that you think would be effective or equally as important, non-effective? Are there steps that the U.S. government might take which you think will, from the perspective of Hong Kong's business climate, make things worse or be counterproductive? No need to answer the second one, but just wanted to put it out there because oftentimes as we have these discussions, I think we sometimes can forget what the second and third order effects of actions that we might take in the United States or other capitals, what those might be for Hong Kong. I think you're on mute again. That's all right. It's a very common COVID era problem.
I think when we look at Hong Kong, we have to put it in perspective. Hong Kong is a business place. Hong Kong is not a political arena. So therefore, dealing with Hong Kong, we should try to depoliticize everything. And Hong Kong cannot control its politics. Hong Kong is part of China, and it comes with a lot of goodies and baddies and whatever you call it, right? But if our idea is really how to make Hong Kong great again and how to preserve Hong Kong as a global hub, there's got to be some give and take. I mean, it's true. I mean, the national security law has put a dent on the confidence of Hong Kong. But having said so, that's something we have to address. I mean, if you have a country, a sovereign nation next to you, and you're part of it, they don't feel comfortable with you with respect to political stability, with respect to national security, you basically will have no future. So we have to address that head on. And China actually has been quite, I would say, in the handling of the entire 2019 protests and the measure has been quite controlled. But having said so, China is not really used to dealing with Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is an international place. We are used to dealing with everybody in the world. And China only started opening up. And China was the initiator and the collaborator and biggest promoter of China's economic reform. So if we put that in perspective, in fact, we have to have some confidence in the ability of Hong Kong to change China. And we have to have some confidence in China knowing the right thing to do with Hong Kong. Now, I agree, a lot of things happening now seem to give rise to the perception things are not really going right. And there are a lot of things going wrong. But fundamentally, I don't think China wants anything bad for Hong Kong. And likewise, I know the U.S. is doing a lot for Hong Kong as well, because the U.S. also highly value the place of Hong Kong, international trade, and even in the whole international community. So if that's the case, then I mean, in helping Hong Kong, I think the best is really to decouple a lot of the issue from the normal political imageries. I mean, and then focus on the pragmatic thing. For example, how to make Hong Kong more palatable as an international place, how to actually attract more talent to Hong Kong. And if we have the national security law, well, every country has it. How can we actually collectively legislate a proper Article 23 so that everybody know what to do and what not to do? I mean, the national security law is a very specific thing and cannot be so encompassing on just about everything in life. So if we stay clear of some of the crucial things, I think we can find a path. We have common language with China and also with the international community. I think the bottom line is Hong Kong people also need to speak out. Frankly, a couple of years ago, I founded a political party in Hong Kong precisely for that, because I felt that Hong Kong politics was kidnapped by the establishment, at the same time was pushed way too excessive or way too populist. And that is not really reflecting what most Hong Kong people want. I think most people in Hong Kong, they're pretty middle of the road. And they neither want too much trouble, nor they want to have too much liberalism or the freedom of speech is important, but certainly not on the high agenda. I mean, Hong Kong has its own unique cultural background, historical background, all that. And we should respect that. So when dealing with Hong Kong from the governments from around the world, I know they mean well, but very often the way they came across could seem almost like arrogant or a bit hypocritical, especially given the context of history. I mean, don't forget Hong Kong was a colony. I mean, under the colony during the British day, by definition, there's no democracy. Right. And there's really a lot of things that we're talking about. And Hong Kong has come a long way. And that, I mean, to a great extent, it's because, I mean, China and Hong Kong really work very well, and also with the international community. So I think my central message is really to depoliticize Hong Kong and focus on the necessity, focus on the pragmatic aspect, and we might find some common ground. And people are not stupid. I think people in China, they look to Hong Kong, they want to be part of Hong Kong, they all want to come to Hong Kong, and they hope that China one day will become just as prosperous as Hong Kong. And we just have to believe that at the end of the day, I mean, Chinese are no different from American. Speaking from my own perspective, having lived in the U.S. for so long and being a Chinese, I do feel that. So we need to have some perspective, some confidence. At the same time, we try to have some guardrail, try to stay away some really, really sensitive political issue that's really for politics more than for the pragmatic, for generating more harmony and stability for Hong Kong.
Thanks, Charles. Ho-Feng, I wonder if I can ask you to answer your own question, which is, which I thought you put well, how do we prevent this from getting worse? And I would say that to some extent, although it sounds like a fairly pessimistic question, there's actually a sliver of optimism there, because we're holding out the hope that there are steps that can be taken that can preserve the remaining autonomy that Hong Kong possesses, or try to revive some of the now constrained autonomy that Hong Kong once enjoyed. So if you were laying out a roadmap, or at least had some practical steps for what can be done, whether that's in Washington, whether that's in London, or whether that's in Hong Kong, what would you advise?
Actually, that policy change for the better or prevention of the further deterioration of the policy, it is definitely totally up to the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government and the people on the ground. With the example of the zero COVID in mainland China, we see that like a few months ago, people are very pessimistic, thinking that the zero COVID is going to stay for a long time. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, that nobody expect that there's this kind of A4 protests around the country that put enough pressure on the Chinese government actually to revoke the zero COVID policy that was unthinkable just like 3 months ago. But of course, now that is another set of problem with the surge and unpreparedness of that. But policy change is possible, but it needs to be from the government and from the people on the ground. And unfortunately, from a foreign government perspective, there's very little that we could do to contribute to that. But there's a lot like nothing we can do. That one thing that the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government care about is, as you very well said and very well captured in your question, is to maintaining the talents and money in Hong Kong. If the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government are still practical, back in the days of the Sino-British negotiation about Hong Kong future in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a mass exodus of middle-class, wealthy people outside of Hong Kong, that so much so that it worried Beijing enough that they make all the promise about one country, two system, universal suffrage. Of course, that is like promise pretty much broken, many of them. But at least that it could have been worse for 1997 if it had not been for this kind of mass exodus. So people in Hong Kong, even if they are not able or not willing to resort to collective action to effectuate the change, they can vote by their feet. They can live as a kind of a passive form of protest. And I'm not being cynical and sounding bleak here, but what foreign government, U.S. government, UK government, and a government around the world can do in that regard is that maintain the route and maintain the channel of people who want to live. For immediate effect, for example, that the Biden administration in 2021 has this default enforcement directive for certain people from Hong Kong. They can stay in the U.S. for a longer period, don't need to go back to Hong Kong to face political persecution. Now that directive is going to expire in early February. That's one immediate thing that the U.S. government could do, is to pay attention to this kind of situation and to make sure that people who want to leave or in danger if they don't leave and can leave. Even for people who are not in jeopardy of being persecuted politically and they want to seek alternative education opportunity, like studying in the U.S., that what U.S. and other government can do is that to expand some programs and encourage more people to come to study, to live, to invest, or maybe they will one day go back. They are not leaving Hong Kong for good, but to maintain this channel open is very important. That the British government, of course, has this BNO visa. That Beijing government is not very happy about, but there's little they can do about it. But it actually did a good part in offering people in Hong Kong some choice, so that if things really deteriorate and then the exodus expand in terms of the leaving of people and money and talents and young people, then Beijing will take note, and then it will exert certain pressure and influence on the policy-making process in Hong Kong and Beijing. So it is something that U.S. government, UK government, and government around the world could at least do. That is to maintain the channel and the route for people who want to leave Hong Kong, either leaving for good or seeking education, alternative the employment investment opportunity open. That from a selfish perspective, actually, of course, that it is what many Western governments like Australia and Canada do in the 1980s and 1990s. They benefit from the massive exodus of money and people from Hong Kong. So it is a win-win situation, and it is something that actually we can actually do more about.
Thanks, Ho-Feng.
I just wanted to underscore Ho-Feng's point about the deferred enforced departure and the fact that that deadline is in fact coming up so quickly. It's imperative that the Biden administration act so that people who are here who have decided, you know what, we actually do need to stay in the U.S. permanently, have the option to have the time to apply for asylum that they need here. And not only that, deferred enforced departure is a temporary solution. It's for people who are still trying to decide whether or not they can go back or they have to stay here permanently. But I would really urge Congress and the administration to look towards some of the longer term solutions, like priority to refugee status, that expedites the process for resettlement here and makes it possible for people who absolutely have to flee Hong Kong to be able to find safe haven here. I think that's absolutely critical, and I'm glad to hear Ho-Feng raising that point.
Hanscom, can I give you the final benediction here? What are your thoughts on practical steps that can be taken. Of course, Hofeng's central point is fundamentally correct of, ultimately it will be the people on the ground who will shape events more than foreign governments. But we're narrowing the discussion here just for the sake of the discussion to thinking about steps that could be taken by the U.S. And I'd like to put this similar question that I put to Charles, which is, any positive steps you think the U.S. can take, but equally any steps you think we could take that would be counterproductive.
Well, first of all, I agree with what everyone has said about the importance of supporting the Hong Kong people. And the Consul General rightly highlighted the need to maintain and strengthen ties between think tanks, academia, make certain that there are students who continue to flow in both directions. The people-to-people ties have always been one of the most important parts of the U.S.-Hong Kong relationship. At the same time, we have to support Hong Kongers who are already here, and that means extending deferred enforced departure, offering other safe haven options for Hong Kongers. There have been proposals in Congress. I hope that those are revived and strengthened, because ultimately Hong Kongers are in the midst of a long-term struggle. I'm very optimistic about Hong Kong and its resiliency. Ultimately, this, to me, boils down to Beijing's lack of confidence in Hong Kong and in Hong Kongers. We're seeing efforts to coerce and repress rather than to attract. In the past, there was always so much common ground between China and the rest of the international community about Hong Kong's status and importance. Sadly, that has gone away. But I hope that we can start to reclaim that common ground because people do want Hong Kongers to succeed. And there's an excellent framework for that everyone agreed to. It worked quite well for decades. And the solution, again, is not repression and trying to legislate quote-unquote stability or patriotism, but it's allowing the institutions to work in the way that they were originally planned. They may not necessarily always be perfect, but they allowed Hong Kong to achieve an extraordinary degree of success up until 2019. The United States needs to continue to work very closely with allies and partners to highlight Hong Kong's status. Hong Kong is not simply another Chinese city. It is part of China, but its status is different. And we have to remember that because we can't allow Hong Kong to become a precedent. This is an international obligation, and it really is an international issue. So I think that has to be the basis. For the United States, the baseline for our policy has always been supporting Hong Kong's autonomy and supporting Hong Kong's special status and supporting Hong Kongers themselves. And we have to continue to use that as our point of departure rather than approaching everything from a perspective of it's just another Chinese city, because that's not the case.
Well, I want to thank, first and foremost, everyone for joining us here on the panel. I hope Greg has retired for the night, but if he's out there, I would like to thank the current Consul General. I'd like to thank his predecessor, Hanscom Smith, who's been a great partner on thinking through these issues and putting this event together. Charles Wong, I want to thank you for likewise staying up late to share your perspectives, which I think were very much appreciated. Hofeng, thank you for beaming in from Baltimore, one of the greatest cities in the United States, I have to say, having done my undergraduate education there. And Olivia, congratulations on the new report. And as Olivia said, we scratched the surface of its recommendations. So highly recommend folks go over to the committee's website where they can download and digest the full report. And then finally, thanks to all the audience members, for those of you who got up a little bit earlier than normal for a think tank event, and for those who stayed up a little later than normal. And maybe I'm just demonstrating how I'm in middle age, and the idea of staying up till past 8 o'clock seems quite late. But regardless, thanks everyone, and have a great day.